As I mentioned, I'm Kevin Heaton with Utah State University Extension. I've been working with pastures here in Panguitch for, 15, 16 years, and it's been a lot of fun. And here's just an example of the pastures that we're working with down here in Panguitch. One thing we noticed from this is a monoculture of tall fescue. I think it's actually two varieties of tall fescue. And I think the fence line contrast is just a little bit of grazing on the right and regular pasture on the left. But we look at these pastures and say, wow, that's really good. And then you look at the research or the data that Earl just shared about having legumes in your pasture and the reduction in fertilizer or nitrogen fertilizer that you need to apply. And so that when we planted this pasture, we didn't put any legumes into it. And so we look at that cost savings, particularly when fuel goes through the roof and it's tied to, or the fertilizer price is tied a lot to petroleum. And therefore, you really start to look at saying, how can we get free fertilizer? And one way to do that is get legumes into the mix. Some of the benefits of fertilizer or of interseeding legumes into your cool season pastures is the ability of the legumes to affix nitrogen, and that means they pull nitrogen out of the air and make it available through natural processes in the soil to the grass. The other thing, one thing that's I think is fairly important. This is a graph of the grass production. Kind of, it's a typical graph. It's not actual data, but it just kind of gives you a good idea. And Neil alluded to this fact that, and Earl did as well. We get about 60 to 70, maybe 75% of our production during this May, June time period, when those cool season grasses are really growing rapidly and they're really producing. That's why we call them cool season grasses, is because they produce during the cool season. That's typically what we have in most of Utah. Another reason we would want to put legumes in our pastures is because we've got this, what we call the dog days of summer, when you look out at that pasture and it's been 2 weeks and it hasn't grown an inch, and you're like, what's going on? Well, the temperature has just shut down those plants, and we have this deficient, a little trough of production. And if you can get some legumes planted in these pastures, then that's when they thrive, is in those hot part of the summer. And the other reason you'd want legumes in your pasture is just improve quantity and quality of forage. Just some real quick basics of interseeding legumes, and what we're I guess we probably just need to define. And I think you can interseed a lot of things into existing crops or pastures, but for us, we're talking legumes like alfalfa, bird's foot trefoil, or sainfoin, just to name a few. And we're taking those and we're putting them into we're planting them into an existing pasture. And I in preparation for this presentation, I read a quote and I thought, wow, that is exactly the experience that I've had and seen the last several years I've worked with pastures. And I hate it when people read, but this is a good point, and I'd just like to read that quote. It says, interseeding legumes into grass-dominated stand is difficult and often fails. For interseeding to succeed, competition from established plants must be eliminated, either chemically or culturally. And so basically what we have got to do if we're going to be successful in this endeavor is we've got to set those grasses back, either chemically or culturally. And here's a couple of pictures of some research plots that we were doing in Panguitch, one where we mowed it really close took it down below that suggested crop stubble that Earl was talking about, or we tilled it up. Now, there was some research done across 3 states, Oregon, Colorado, and Idaho. And what they did was they did no suppression, just a control. They mowed it very close. They applied glyphosate. And if you look at the results, the glyphosate in both Colorado and Idaho got decent results in pretty much whatever you put out there and planted. And they were using I believe it was a no-till drill in those scenarios. However, we really need to look at, and they were doing this in the spring of the year. We need to go back and look at the rate of Roundup that they were using. They were using 1 quart of Roundup per acre, which is pretty, it's a little more than suppression treatments is what I would call. It's more of a killing treatment. If you read the glyphosate label, or at least one that I read this evening, they're talking 8 ounces for a suppression or suppression rate. And I think we used 6 ounces in the research that we did back a few years ago. Another thing, if you look here in Idaho, this red clover was pretty good at establishing, no matter whether you use control or not in Idaho. Everywhere else, it failed. And I would mention that the stuff up in Oregon was a failure as well. So let's go back to the 2 things. We need to compete or outcompete the existing grasses. And the research that I just talked about was done in the spring of the year when those grasses are growing extremely aggressive. And you look at this graph, and I use this graph for a lot to drive home a lot of points, but for interseeding legumes, it just shows me, it's really graphic, that if we want to be successful, we need to be interseeding these sometime in July. And what we'll kind of skip over that to the research that we did here in Utah, that was Jacob Briscoe did with Earl and Mike Peel and others. But he did spring, summer, fall seedings, and he found that, and they did they did Roundup suppression, they did tillage, they did mowing on those plots, and they planted alfalfa, birchfoot, trefoil, and Sisera milk vetch. Anyway, what they found was they had decent results on those plots if they seeded in the summer. So if their competition or their control or suppression of the grass was effective in the summer, that allowed the legumes to establish, and that's when they really like to grow and do the best, or play their best game, is during that summertime. So that just drove home the point from that graph to this research, that's when we need to kind of throw out that conventional idea that we need to either sow in the spring or in the fall, and we really need to look at the summer. Just a few species that we can look at as far as selecting, and I'm getting short on time, so we'll just run through these real quick. But alfalfa, birchfoot, trefoil, Sisera milk vetch, sainfoin, and red clover. So we did that research, and that's kind of what it showed. And then I kind of like to take research a step further and do demonstrations and apply some of the things on a bigger scale in a 10 by 30 foot plot, or a 50 by, a 6 by 100 foot plot. So we got a tractor and a drill. It's a Plantovator. It's got these shanks right down here by the drill, and then it's got a couple of rippers on it, and it's got press wheels, and it basically just rips a shank, deposits the seed, and does a pretty good job. These are some more pictures of it. The only problem is if you're your plant, if the soil is wet, then it plugs up, and you can spend 15 minutes planting and an hour unplugging the drill. So, how are we on time?
It looks like we're up, Kevin, on that.
Okay, so we'll just go. I had a little video, but we'll skip that. Just some of the results. We had okay results, and just some final thoughts. Just limit the competition. Don't fertilize with nitrogen because that stimulates grass growth. Do fertilize with phosphorus and potassium, which stimulates the legume growth. And if you aren't familiar with inoculations of the seed, you need to make sure that that is appropriate for the seed that you use. Otherwise, your interseeding is just going to be very ineffective. And pay attention to broadleaf weed control.